So we're here today talking about the tenant application process and how it affects landlords and tenants. So Susie, what should a landlord look for when they're selecting a tenant?
Very, very important question actually. When it comes to tenant selection, the landlord needs to look at the financial security of the tenant. When I mean financial security, income, and also secure position in employment. Secondly, I think the landlord needs to consider, has the tenant had a previous rental history? Have they maintained the property? Has their bond been refunded in full? These are all questions that you need to ask as a landlord, which actually really sort of indicate what sort of tenant they've been in the past.
So what issues can arise when a landlord chooses a tenant that doesn't meet all the right criteria?
Obviously we don't encourage that, but in a slow market it is a consideration for the landlord. They do need to consider all applicants. We obviously are concerned when you do have a non-approved tenant in a property because there could be some issues with rent arrears or maintaining the property or actually advising us of any maintenance. So they're the main issues I think you need to consider.
What governs how a property should be managed?
There is a governing legislation called Residential Tenancies Act. There are obligations as a landlord to maintain the property. There are also obligations as a tenant to maintain the property and report maintenance and to pay their rent on time. So the legislation is quite intricate and involved, and it does not allow a landlord to make free choices about removing tenants from properties, for example. If the tenant has certainly had a situation of rent arrears, for example, the landlord has to go through a process under the legislation to remove or evict the tenant.
Who makes these decisions?
All mediation for landlords and tenants is done through the Residential Tenancies Tribunal. So it's a governing body that actually acts under the Act, under the Tenancies Act, and we as agents can refer all complaints to this body and get mediation for it.
Is it like a court situation?
There is actually a judge who makes decisions under the Act. So we have to present our case, or the tenant has to present their case, and it is under the law.
Is there any other legislation that affects managing a property and selecting a tenant?
I think probably the most important legislation is the Privacy Act. As agents, we can't give out landlords' or tenants' details. The Privacy Act will govern that. And secondly, the Equal Opportunities Act and legislation, we can't discriminate between tenants, race, colour, etc. So certainly clients, landlords need to be mindful of these legislation which does govern how you manage a property as well.
How can a tenant give themselves the best chance of being selected for a property?
Very important question. Tenants always just assume that they're going to have every right to that property. We always say to our clients as tenants, please make sure you submit your application and actually fill out all details. There's quite a lot of information involved in applying for a property, so the more information you give us, the more opportunity you have to be selected. When I say information, I'm talking about income, job security, advising us who your employment is, making sure that all your referees are aware that you are actually going to be applying for this property and that we will be ringing them. Also, just make sure you have your 100 points of ID, being a proof of identity, your driver's licence, passport, proof of bank statements to confirm your income. This sort of information really does actually stand strong with your application.
Does a landlord have to give any reason for not selecting a tenant?
That's a great question because we get that asked all the time. Absolutely not. Landlords do not have to give any reason as to why that tenant was successful in applying for that property.
Can tenants be notified when a suitable property comes up?
At Toop&Toop we have a fabulous computer software package called Virtual Agent. The idea behind Virtual Agent is that you actually register as a renter and put in your application that you are looking for a certain property, a certain size, number of bedrooms, car parking, price range, and of course area that you're looking for. And then this software package will actually advise you when a property that meets your criteria comes onto the market. So it's a really great way of knowing about properties in advance before they actually hit the market.
So we've got the tenant in. What happens if a tenant breaks their lease?
Tenants actually have a lot of responsibility to that lease up until new tenants are found. They've signed a legal document called a residential tenancy agreement, and that means that they have to continue paying their rent until the new tenant moves in. They're also responsible for the marketing and the re-letting of that property. It is on a formula based on the Residential Tenancies Act, so they're responsible for a portion of those costs. However, tenants do think it's quite easy to move out of their property and break their lease. It is quite expensive. So we do advise them to consider their options before breaking their lease, to get further advice from us as agents, because there is enormous expense involved in breaking your lease. The realities are that we may not find a suitable tenant to take on your property for quite a few weeks, and therefore you are responsible for paying your rent up until that tenant moves in. So my advice to tenants, please be careful. It is an expensive exercise.